Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as Himiko rose, not from conquest or birthright, but from silence. In the fractured land of Wa, a collection of chiefdoms scattered across the Japanese archipelago during the late Yayoi period, violence was not the exception, but the norm. Civil wars between rival clans had worn down alliances, shattered villages, and stripped the land of stability. Chieftains jostled for power, while famine loomed and traditions fractured. It was in this climate of unrest that a figure unlike any other emerged. She did not raise armies, she did not speak to crowds. She withdrew behind veils, behind screens, behind ritual. But even so, her presence was felt in every corner of Yamatai, a central kingdom whose influence began to spread under her name. The early Chinese dynastic records called her Himiko, a name meaning sunchild or sun-daughter. What her own people called her remains unknown. What mattered was that the people obeyed. Himiko's rule began not with force, but with consensus born from desperation. The violence of previous years had reached such a fever pitch that a council of clans, according to Chinese sources, appointed her in a last attempt to bring order. She was not a queen in the conventional sense. She was a shaman, a medium between the human world and the divine. Rituals, trances, and acts of spiritual interpretation became the tools of governance. Her decisions, often delivered through a male relative who served as her intermediary, carried the weight of sacred law. No one challenged her directly, but neither did anyone fully understand her. Her court grew around this mystery. Where other rulers commanded from open halls, Himiko remained in isolation, guarded and unseen. She was served by hundreds of female attendants, chosen not for lineage, but for loyalty and ritual purpose. Foreign visitors were rarely granted an audience, and when they were, they met not the queen herself, but her representatives, who interpreted her words as messages from beyond. The political consequences of her rule were immediate. Warfare between clans diminished. The hierarchy of Yamatai solidified, with Himiko at its center. Her authority extended far enough to warrant recognition from the powerful Wei dynasty in China, which recorded her name and her gifts in state documents. This was more than diplomacy. It was evidence of legitimacy, a seal placed by one empire upon another. Within Wa, rival chiefdoms now had to choose whether to fall in line with Himiko's rule or be cast outside the new order. Some accepted her authority, others resisted in silence. But no open challenge would succeed. Not yet. Her power, while spiritual in form, became deeply political in practice. Law and religion merged. Order was enforced through belief, not through violence. And belief, when cultivated carefully, could be stronger than any sword. But beneath the surface, tension remained. Yamatai was not a unified state, but a coalition. And coalitions fracture when trust becomes too dependent on mystery. Himiko's withdrawal gave her the aura of the divine, but it also kept her distant from the ambitions of others. Even in her earliest days, those closest to the throne knew that silence, once feared, could also be questioned. And far from her ritual chamber, someone was already calculating what might happen if that silence broke. In the first years of Queen Himiko's reign, the court adjusted not to the presence of a monarch, but to her absence. She did not sit in public council. She did not speak directly to her chiefs. Instead, she governed through rituals, symbols, and intermediaries. Her brother, whose name was never recorded, became her voice in matters of state, carrying messages outward from her inner chamber to the wider world of Yamatai. Surrounding her were female attendants trained in rites of purification and divination, selected not for birth but for discipline. To approach the queen required layers of permission. To see her face was a privilege few could claim. Yet even without her physical presence, her rule left a clear imprint, one defined by order, distance, and control. The system she built relied not on visibility, but on perception. Each decree, each ritual offering was crafted with deliberate ambiguity. Oracles were consulted before major decisions. Dreams were interpreted by trusted seers. It was a court run by silence, not as a weakness, but as a method of power. To question a ruling was to question the spirits themselves. The aristocracy adjusted carefully. Land disputes were no longer settled by duels or tribal force, but through symbolic offerings, adjudicated by priests under her name. Clans began to send tribute instead of warriors. Stone and bronze were replaced by mirrors, beads, and ritual goods, objects that reflected light, order, and submission. Still, beneath these changes, older loyalties remained. Some chiefs observed the new customs, but remembered the old wars. Himiko's seclusion created a psychological divide. It allowed her to project authority as more than human, as a medium between the people and the gods. But it also created dependency. Every political move required interpretation. Every message passed through hands that could alter its shape. Her brother became more than a messenger. He became a gatekeeper. With no clear structure beyond the court, regional leaders were left to guess how decisions were made or who truly influenced them. This uncertainty gave her power over those who feared divine punishment. But it also gave room for rivals to imagine weakness behind the curtain. The lack of transparency became a source of both reverence and suspicion. Beyond Yamatai's borders, other chiefdoms watched her rise with unease. The unification of smaller states under a single ruler threatened their autonomy. Some began strengthening their own rituals in response. Others sent scouts to gather information on her court. But the mystery held. Even the emissaries of Wei, who received letters and tribute from Himiko, were not granted a direct audience. What they recorded was a woman who ruled unseen, whose influence stretched across distant shores, but whose true self remained hidden behind ceremonial form. For her supporters, that invisibility confirmed her sacred role. For her critics, it concealed something more dangerous, a break from custom, a concentration of power without equal. As Yamatai stabilized, alliances began to solidify around her rule. But in the outlying provinces, where ancestral gods still held sway, murmurs continued. A queen who lived in shadows, whose will was carried by others, who spoke not to her people but through dreams and silence. Such a figure could command awe, but she could not erase old beliefs. And even as her rituals spread, even as her name appeared in Chinese records, there were those who wondered who or what truly ruled behind the mirror. When the emissaries of the Wei dynasty crossed the sea from the Chinese mainland to the islands of Wa, they entered a world unfamiliar to imperial order. The tribes of Japan were fragmented, led by competing warlords, loosely bound by shared customs and ritual, but with no unified law. Yet when the envoys reached Yamatai, they found not chaos, but control. Not a chieftain behind a warrior's banner, but a queen who spoke through rites and intermediaries. Himiko did not meet them in person. She sent her message through formal gifts: fine jade, rare pearls, cloth woven from local fibers, and red cinnabar. The items were not just tokens of alliance, they were signals of intent. In a region where no other power had reached across borders in this way, Himiko positioned herself not as a subject, but as a participant in a diplomatic world far beyond the islands. The message she returned away was carefully phrased. It acknowledged the emperor's supremacy, offered deference to his divine authority, and requested official recognition in return. In China's system of tributary diplomacy, such gestures implied submission. But for Himiko, this was strategy, not surrender. By placing Yamatai within the orbit of the Middle Kingdom, she gained more than prestige. She gained legitimacy, not only in foreign eyes, but in the eyes of her rivals at home. When the Chinese court granted her the seal and title of Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei, it created a new reality. Her authority was no longer only rooted in ritual and oral tradition. It was now inscribed in foreign records, reinforced by one of the most powerful empires in East Asia. The consequences were immediate and complex. At home, her court displayed the gifts from Wei in controlled ceremonies, reinforcing her divine image. The bronze mirrors, in particular, symbols of both cosmology and imperial favor, were distributed with care to reinforce loyalty among key clans. But not all received them. Some leaders, particularly those in western regions beyond Yamatai's full control, viewed the alliance with suspicion. For them, the Chinese title was not a crown. It was a provocation. They had not elected her. They did not recognize her divine visions. And now, a foreign seal threatened to silence their voices under an unfamiliar order. Himiko's position, while stronger than ever, became more exposed. The acknowledgement from Wei placed her at the center of foreign attention, but also foreign expectation. Continued tribute would be required. Future envoys would return. Trade would increase, but so would the scrutiny. Within Yamatai, the hierarchy hardened. Those closest to Himiko's inner circle gained new status as interpreters of foreign rites and keepers of imported knowledge. Those on the outside found themselves further removed from influence. The political structure tightened around the queen, making her power more centralized but also more contested. For Himiko, this alignment with Wei was a calculated move to secure continuity through external affirmation. It extended her reach beyond the borders of Yamatai, projecting her rule as part of a larger cosmic order. But that order was not shared by all. In the eyes of rival chiefs, she had crossed a line, turning sacred governance into foreign alliance, divine rule into international politics. And as the mirrors of Wei caught the sunlight in court, darker thoughts took shape in shadows far from the capital. In the order Himiko created, silence was not absence. It was control. Her words rarely crossed the thresholds of her chamber, but they echoed across Yamatai through one man. Her brother, unnamed in all records, was more than a messenger. He stood as the living channel through which ritual became rule and spirit became law. Every edict passed through him. Every ceremony requiring her blessing relied on his voice. His role blurred the line between governance and belief. To defy him was to defy her. To defy her was to risk punishment not just from the court, but from the world of spirits she was said to command. And so, for many years, this quiet arrangement held, stable, precise, and impenetrable. But as her influence spread and foreign alliances solidified, the weight of that structure began to rest more heavily on his shoulders. His presence in court became more infrequent. Advisories arrived slower. His physical strength, never mentioned directly, began to fade in subtle ways. Fewer appearances, delayed responses, confusion in protocol. To the outside world, the Queen's voice seemed distant, less consistent, less clear. Inside the palace, concern gave way to calculation. Without him, no one knew how decisions would reach the outer court. And without decisions, power would drift. Rival clans, some who had long resented Himiko's alliance with Wei, others who had quietly maintained lineages of male succession, began to stir. New faces appeared among the regional elites, claiming descent from old warriors and divine ancestors. Some whispered that a queen who could not speak without a man's voice could not rule alone. Others questioned the rituals entirely, suggesting that her power came not from the heavens, but from court manipulation and foreign influence. Though no open challenge was made, the language of resistance shifted. Tribute was delayed. Ritual envoys did not return. And in one province, a regional shrine removed her emblem from its ceremonial site. Within the central court, the balance became more fragile. The officials who once carried out her brother's words began to divide. Some called for the naming of a new male regent to preserve continuity. Others insisted that no succession was needed, that Himiko, as a divine medium, transcended any earthly replacement. The lack of precedent left no clear path forward. And as the court debated, the Queen herself remained unseen. Her silence, once a source of reverence, now cast a shadow of uncertainty. This moment revealed not just the vulnerability of one man, but the deeper fragility of a system built on mediated rule. The structure Himiko had designed required layers, veils, interpreters, rituals, but those layers depended on human endurance. Her brother had anchored that world. Without him, the mechanics of her power slowed. Decisions required new channels. Trust had to be renegotiated. Her isolation, once protective, now risked becoming absolute. And beyond the palace walls, in provinces where loyalty had always been conditional, the question was no longer whether she ruled by divine right, but whether anyone truly ruled at all. The fragile peace that Himiko had shaped through ritual and diplomacy did not hold. In the western reaches of the archipelago, where the influence of Yamatai thinned and old tribal lines remained strong, the rival kingdom of Kunu rejected the authority granted to her by foreign seals and sacred rites. For years, they had tolerated her emissaries, offered tribute when necessary, and watched as Yamatai's influence crept outward. But the moment her hold weakened, after the voice of her rule, her brother fell silent. They acted. It began as resistance to new tribute demands. Then envoys were turned away. Then word reached the capital that shrines aligned with Himiko had been desecrated. The rebellion had begun. The campaign that followed was unlike anything Yamatai had faced under her rule. It was not a single clash, but a slow unraveling. A war of attrition fought through ambushes, ritual desecrations, and the targeted killing of loyal provincial leaders. Villages aligned with Yamatai were burned. Sacred groves once marked by Himiko's symbols, became burial grounds for the dead. Inscriptions found centuries later on iron weapons suggest not just battle, but occupation, evidence of prolonged resistance, not temporary revolt. The Kunu alliance, made up of smaller chieftains drawn to its defiance, understood that this was more than a political uprising. It was a war over spiritual legitimacy. Himiko did not appear before her people. She issued no public address, but orders continued to emerge from her court, decisive, severe, and delivered through new intermediaries whose names did not carry the weight of her brother's voice. Military retainers, long dormant under her reign of peace, were mobilized. Supply chains were redirected. Iron weapons, still rare in much of Japan, were distributed to Yamatai-aligned forces. The court, once structured around ritual, began to resemble a command center. But without the sacred distance that once held her rule above bloodshed, Himiko's image began to shift. The queen who had ruled through stillness now ruled through fear. As fighting dragged into seasons, the cost mounted. Agricultural regions near the contested border were stripped of labor. Trade slowed. Internal communication faltered. The rituals at her temple continued, but their meanings changed. They no longer marked harvest or alliance. They marked the dead. Reports reached the court of priests executed in Kunu territory, of female attendants captured and paraded before defaced shrines. Bones were left in heaps as warnings. What began as a political rejection had turned into a cultural and spiritual fracture, a rejection of the entire world Himiko had created. Amid this violence, her brother disappeared from all record. No formal announcement was made. No ceremony marked his passing. But those who studied the court structure noted his absence in the flow of command. In his place, a new layer of intermediaries emerged, younger, less familiar, more aggressive in tone. The court no longer moved as one. It adjusted piece by piece to a new rhythm, one defined by reaction, not control. And while Himiko's name still carried weight, it no longer moved untouched above the fray. In the eyes of both her enemies and her subjects, she had entered the war. And in doing so, something sacred had been lost. Time moved forward, but Queen Himiko remained unchanged. The written accounts, limited and distant, preserved a ruler who seemed untouched by age or frailty. No new descriptions appeared. No alterations to her image were made. Her seclusion continued without interruption, as if preserved outside the normal patterns of life and decline. But the structure around her shifted. The court she had once shaped in careful balance had hardened. Rituals, once responsive to seasons and political needs, grew more elaborate and fixed. Ceremonies extended in length, offerings increased in volume, and behind the walls of her compound, silence became heavier. Without her brother's presence, a new generation of intermediaries emerged. They were not drawn from the old aristocracy of Yamatai, but from more distant provinces. Figures with fewer connections to the fractured past and greater dependency on the queen's favor. These new advisors, loyal by necessity, built their power not through lineage but through proximity. In this environment, ambiguity returned as strategy. Orders became more difficult to interpret. Decisions passed through layers of ritual before they reached the outer court. And though the machinery of governance remained intact, its rhythm slowed. Messages traveled slower. Reactions lagged. The clarity that had once marked Himiko's early rule was no longer present. Within the palace, uncertainty grew. The queen's isolation, once a source of divine mystique, began to resemble something else. A retreat not only from danger, but from the world itself. Her spiritual role had once bridged the human and divine. Now it seemed to drift entirely into the unseen. Some believed this signaled a deepening of her power, an evolution into a higher state, but others, especially those closer to the rituals themselves, worried that her devotion had narrowed into fixation. She no longer addressed matters of war. She no longer received envoys. Even when new tribute arrived from Wei, no public acknowledgement followed. The mirrors, symbols of imperial recognition, were placed quietly in storage. Across the outer provinces, this change brought consequences. The authority of Yamatai had always depended on balance between visible strength and spiritual distance. With Himiko's presence withdrawn even further, regional leaders began testing the boundaries of autonomy. In some districts, local rituals returned. In others, tribute decreased. And though no open resistance emerged, the cohesion that held the territory together began to loosen. Power, once tightly controlled, became diffused. The court attempted to maintain order through dispatches and oaths, but without direct engagement, these efforts lacked force. Inside the inner court, fear began to replace reverence. Those responsible for communicating her will no longer ask questions. Instructions were carried out exactly as received, even when they conflicted or arrived late. The structure around the queen became more insular, more rigid, less adaptable. And in this narrowing circle, the queen, who had once commanded distant provinces and foreign emperors, now moved only within her chamber, her rituals, and the space between incense and silence. The continuity of her rule was preserved in form, but not in presence. And though she was still obeyed, still named in tribute, the people no longer waited for her to speak. They waited to see whether she still would. The silence that once held the court in order began to shift. Tribute from the Wei dynasty, once delivered with formality and regularity, no longer arrived on schedule. Where once came mirrors and seals, now there were delays and uncertainty. The mainland was facing turmoil, changes within the Wei court, instability along trade routes, and a growing distance between the Middle Kingdom and its distant tributaries. Without the foreign acknowledgement that had long reinforced Himiko's divine legitimacy, a new doubt crept through the court. The title granted by China, once used to silence critics, now sat heavier, more vulnerable, as if its weight no longer guaranteed its worth. At the edge of this vacuum, a younger figure began to emerge. Iyo, believed to be a relative of Himiko, had lived largely outside the central court, her name unknown in earlier records. But in the provinces, her presence became harder to ignore. Known for her calm bearing and ritual clarity, she gained attention from those disillusioned with the palace's growing opacity. She offered no rebellion, no claims to power, only participation in ceremonies that others described as measured, balanced, and clear. In a time where the queen's rituals had become longer, more isolating, and increasingly severe, Iyo's presence offered something the people had not seen in years: accessibility. Inside the palace, small changes carried meaning. Rituals that once aligned with lunar phases now shifted without explanation. Sacrifices increased, not in spectacle, but in frequency. Offerings of grain and animal bone, once symbols of harmony, became solemn acts of atonement. Attendants noticed changes in timing, in tone, in silence. Her closest advisors followed these shifts without question, but others watched with unease. Some refused to interpret the Queen's directives. Others began withholding names from ritual rolls. The old unity fractured not through violence, but through silence. Broken protocols, unspoken absences, prayers left unfinished. Political consequences followed. Regional leaders who once aligned tightly with Yamatai began exploring alternate connections, strengthening local shrines, sending observers to Iyo ceremonies, pausing tribute deliveries to the capital. The court in Yamatai could not act directly. To move against Iyo would be to acknowledge her influence. To ignore her, however, allowed her space to grow. Each decision carried risk. So the court delayed, deflected, and watched. Within the Queen's compound, layers of access grew even more restricted. Where once intermediaries came and went with regular rhythm, now fewer messengers emerged. Communication slowed, questions lingered longer, and at the threshold, where ritual space met administrative authority, anxiety settled in. Those who had once shielded the Queen's distance now felt its weight. Her image, once anchored by the mirror gifted from Wei, now stood hollow. And in the space where that mirror had been displayed, where its reflection once confirmed the legitimacy of divine rule, someone, unnamed, unacknowledged, left behind a blade. No message accompanied it. None was needed. In the court built on stillness, this was movement. And in a palace ruled by unseen power, it was a warning no ritual could contain. The strength of Yamatai had long rested on perception, on ritual, stillness, and the illusion of permanence. But across the countryside, where harvests failed and riverbanks swelled with decay, that illusion began to break. Crops, weakened by unseasonal rains and exhausted soil, withered before they could ripen. In isolated villages, sickness spread, not with violence, but with silence. Fever, swelling, unexplained deaths. The common people, once shielded by ceremony, now saw their gods fall quiet. When prayers brought no relief, whispers returned. Accusations of sorcery, of broken oaths, and cursed leadership spread from village to village. The same ruler who had once been revered as divine was now spoken of with fear, and in some places, blame. Fires broke out in settlements once considered secure. Though no single cause was recorded, the pattern was clear. Temples that carried Himiko's seal burned during the night. Offerings were scattered, not stolen. Statues were left overturned. The damage was not for gain, but for message. Loyalty, once bound through spiritual authority, was unraveling. And still, the Queen did not appear. Her isolation had once made her untouchable. Now it made her seem unreachable. Her presence, once interpreted as sacred distance, had become absence. And absence in a time of suffering was indistinguishable from abandonment. From the palace, envoys were sent again to the court of Wei. Their mission was not a tribute of power, but a gesture of distress. The requests, preserved in Chinese chronicles, asked not for honor, but for structure, for calendars, official regalia, and guidance in matters of ritual. These were not the actions of a ruler commanding her region. They were the signals of a government seeking stability from outside its own boundaries. No immediate reply was recorded. The silence from China echoed the silence at home. And in that vacuum, uncertainty grew. Iyo remained a figure of quiet contrast. She made no formal claim to power. She did not mobilize support, but she also did not yield. her followers continued to grow, not through rebellion, but through presence. In a time where the capital closed its gates and covered its mirrors, Io appeared in open-air ceremonies, simple and consistent, offering continuity without conflict. This refusal to engage directly left the court with no clear target. She was not an enemy, but she was no longer invisible. In the heart of Yamatai, the great shrine no longer served the rhythms of season and harvest. Its rituals turned inward, no longer aligned with celestial markers, but with something more urgent and reactive. The drums beat without pause, not in celebration, but in containment. The sound carried across the capital, a low and constant reminder of unrest beneath ritual. Attendants cycled in shifts, keeping the tempo even through night. No explanation was offered. None was needed. Those who had served the queen for years began to lower their heads, not in reverence, but in uncertainty. The calm of the court had curdled into tension. There had been no declaration of collapse, no proclamation of war. But across Yamatai, smoke drifted upward from burned fields, from abandoned shrines, from villages emptied by disease. And though the storm had not yet broken, the sound of drums and the silence of leadership told the people all they needed to know. Something deeper had already fractured. Himiko died in silence. There was no warning, no official report of illness, no slow procession of last rites. The records from China state only that she died. One moment, her court still issued ritual commands. The next, it fell quiet. The announcement, when it came, did not include her age, her cause of death, or her final message. Only absence. The ruler who had governed unseen for decades was now truly gone, leaving a space no prayer could fill. Across the islands, the void she left behind spread quickly, not just through mourning, but through fear. For years, the hierarchy had held together through belief. Belief in her voice, her isolation, her alignment with the divine. With her departure, belief had to find a new anchor, and none existed. The political structure of Yamatai began to unravel almost immediately. Without a successor named, and with no precedent for transferring power from a priest-queen to any other form of rule, factions emerged. Some aligned with surviving members of Himiko's court, insisting on continuity through ritual. Others, long resentful of the capital's dominance, saw an opportunity to reclaim autonomy. Small conflicts broke out. Not civil war, but calculated maneuvers to seize territory, temples, and tribute routes. The court, once a center of ritual stillness, became a contested ground. Alliances formed and broke in rapid succession. The rituals themselves were paused. No one knew whose voice should carry the prayers forward. In this instability, preparations for Himiko's burial took on new urgency. The scale, as recorded by the Wei dynasty, was unprecedented. A massive mound was raised in her honor. Over 100 attendants, believed to be women from her personal inner court, were sacrificed to accompany her into the next world. This act, whether driven by tradition or desperation, was meant to preserve the queen's divine status even in death. But it also emptied the palace of many who had once carried its knowledge. The cost of the burial was not just symbolic, it was structural. Entire networks of ritual, memory, and governance vanished beneath the earth. Io emerged not from power, but from absence. She had taken no sides in the conflicts that followed Himiko's death. She had made no claim to succession. But when envoys from China returned, they recorded a new ruler, a young woman who had restored stability to Yamatai. Her name was Iyo. She was chosen by the court, according to the records, and confirmed by the people. The choice was less about ambition and more about survival. She was not feared, she was not silent. And most importantly, the unrest that followed Himiko's death began to settle once she assumed power. Her emergence was not a victory in the traditional sense. There were no declarations, no conquered rivals. But the rituals resumed, tribute resumed, communication with China resumed. In a time of doubt, Iyo represented continuity, not because she mirrored Himiko's rule, but because she did not. She entered a structure that had nearly collapsed and held it together by presence alone. Where others saw a throne, she carried a role. And in the eyes of a court that had lost its voice, she became the one the spirits had not rejected. Himiko ruled in silence, and she vanished in it as well. No shrine bears her name. No marked tomb identifies her remains. The burial mound, recorded by Chinese envoys, described as vast, sacred, and sealed with blood, has never been found. No inscription confirms its occupant. Yet across the islands of ancient Wa, her presence endured long after her death, not through monuments of stone or declarations of conquest, but through fragments, ritual echoes, unearthed mirrors, names half preserved in the oral traditions of distant clans. In the absence of fact, memory formed around her like mist. Some recalled her as Japan's first sovereign. Others spoke of her as a medium of the gods, a priestess who shaped power through unseen forces. Still others whispered of tyranny cloaked in ritual, of a queen whose silence concealed more than devotion. Her political legacy fractured quickly. The fragile unification she had imposed through spiritual hierarchy and foreign recognition did not survive the generation that followed. Provincial leaders reasserted autonomy. Tributary networks weakened. The court she had constructed, with its strict layers of ritual and distance, could not replicate itself. Even under Iyo, who succeeded her and temporarily restored calm, the structure of centralized spiritual rule began to fade. Power returned to the regions. The title once granted to Himiko by the Wei Emperor was not passed forward in any surviving record. What had been a singular, unprecedented rule dissolved back into the scattered leadership it had once emerged from. But while political continuity faded, cultural memory did not. In the centuries that followed, long after the writing of Chinese dynastic histories and the emergence of Japan's earliest texts, hints of Himiko remained. The Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, composed much later, do not name her directly, but describe figures who resemble her. Women who ruled through divine possession, who spoke to the kami, who held influence from behind the veil. These records were not biographies. They were tools of statecraft, written to unify myth and history under imperial order. Yet even in their omissions, they confirm her absence as presence. She was too powerful to ignore, too enigmatic to define. Mirrors, similar to those listed in Chinese descriptions of Himiko's court, have been discovered in burial mounds throughout Japan. Some bear motifs associated with the sun, others with spiritual transition. Though no mirror has been definitively linked to her, their distribution follows the arc of her supposed influence, clustered around Yamatai's theorized heartlands, radiating outward along ancient trade and tribute paths. These objects, placed in graves of the elite, suggest not only wealth, but authority, believed to be inherited or imitated from a central figure long gone. In these relics, her rule survives not as memory, but as form, the shapes that power left behind when its voice fell quiet. In the imperial court of later centuries, rituals continued that mirrored Himiko's seclusion. The role of the Sayo, imperial priestesses who served at distant shrines, reflected a model of sacred femininity, removed from everyday governance, but deeply connected to legitimacy. The Empress Jingu, another semi-mythical figure from early chronicles, was described with qualities strikingly similar to Himiko, ruling during war, receiving visions, communicating with divine forces. These parallels were not accidental. They were the continuation of a memory not fully recorded, but never erased. The question of Himiko's identity, of whether she was a historical monarch, a religious leader, or a fusion of both, remains unresolved. But her impact lies in more than titles. She governed not through armies, but through order. She created hierarchy through belief, shaped borders through ritual, and defined leadership not by appearance, but by distance. Her authority relied on absence, and in that absence, she became a vessel for meaning far beyond her time. She remains a mirror, not of her own face, but of the world that tried to define her. Was she a shaman, moved by forces beyond comprehension, or a strategist who mastered silence to outlast conflict? Was she a savior who brought peace through divine purpose, or a shadow that cloaked power in mystery? Her rule ended without inscription, but her legacy began the moment the world tried to remember her.